50 years ago this week, the landmark Roe v. Wade case guaranteed women in the US a constitutional right to an abortion. But 7 months ago, this decision was overturned in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, which allowed elected members from individual states to decide whether abortion should be illegal. So far, 13 states have implemented an outright ban on abortions, with 5 more having partial bans so far. So, as people protest in the streets on what would have been the 50th anniversary of Roe v. Wade, was it right to let the states decide whether women can have abortions, or should the blanket law have stayed in place? Do women have the right to choose what happens to their body, or does the killing of a fetus equate to murder? Should Roe v. Wade have been overturned?
So let's get to it. Should Roe v. Wade have been overturned? As always, we begin with a quick fire round, 30 seconds each to lay out your initial stance on the matter, and we pick up the debate from there. So, Amy O'Donnell, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
Roe v. Wade was a case of judicial activism where the Supreme Court justices at the time legislated from the bench something that had been in the hands of the people and their elected representatives. The majority of states across the United States had pro-life laws on the books showing that their ruling was out of touch with the vast majority of Americans. The reality is that the Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization case returned the power to legislate abortion where it always should have been.
Okay, Nicole Brenner-Schmidt, your take?
Look, Roe v. Wade, when it was decided, was built on a whole host of decisions that had happened. It started back in the 1920s, but where kids could go to school. It moved on to contraception. It moved to the 1967 decision of loving, which meant you could get married if you were different races. This is about who we are and can you have personal liberty in this country. And you do not have that if we don't have the right to a decision about our own health and our own bodies and what's going to happen with them.
Last but not least, Professor Noya Rimlat, your thoughts?
So the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe versus Wade is an erroneous decision, both on the constitutional level and on the normative level. On the constitutional level, Dobbs does not follow well-established legal principles with regard to what the right to liberty entails. On the normative level, it sends a very problematic message with regards to women's status in society.
Okay, ladies, and from this point onwards, let's feel free to interact. And I do want to begin our conversation by circling back to a very basic question. Several months after the overturn, do we have a clear answer to the question of who constitutes a person? Amy.
Life begins at conception. This is a scientific fact that students learn in middle school biology. That scientific fact has been taught for many, many years, and that is something that we stand on. Life begins at conception, life matters in the womb, and all life is worthy of protection. The body within a woman's body is not that woman's body. It's a biological fact. It's a separate body, separate DNA, separate fingerprint, unique being from the very beginning.
Nicole.
A woman should have the right to make a decision about her own body and what's happening to it and their choices about her own life. This is something that we've been very, very clear about. Roe does not live in a vacuum. This is about a woman's decision. It's an economic decision. It's a decision for herself and her family. 2/3 of women who seek and obtain abortions in the United States are already mothers. These are women making decisions for their families and for themselves, and this is instrumental in them being a full citizen of this country. And again, Roe is not going to live in a vacuum by itself. It's going to bleed into, do you have the right to marry who you want to marry? Do you have the right to the contraception, to make family planning decisions? This is something that Clarence Thomas told us in the way that he wrote in the Dobbs decision, that this bleeds out into other cases. So this is not going to live by itself, but it has huge ramifications.
So Professor Rimalt, is it indeed not a debate about life versus choice, but rather positive versus negative liberty?
So I want to make some preliminary comments. So first, The statement that life begins at conception, this is a religious conviction. This is not a scientific fact. As a scientific fact, we're first talking about fertilized egg, and then the next stage is an embryo, and then a fetus. So we should be more precise with regard to scientific facts. And then the second thing is when we talk about a woman's right to bodily integrity and autonomy, the right of every person to bodily autonomy is a fundamental right. And if we look around at other principles that deals with the bodily autonomy of every person, we see that this right is usually given priority over other rights, even if it conflicts with the right to life of other people. So you cannot detach the debate about abortion with from other legal debates. And when you're taking a wider perspective, how law is treating a person's right to bodily integrity, you usually find that this right is a supreme right. It is given the utmost protection, even when it conflicts with the right to life of other people.
Amy, is it indeed part of a greater plan here, or is it a more specific fight for or against abortions?
Part of a bigger plan or a more specific fight, just to make sure I'm following you.
No, Professor Rimholt is pointing out that it is not merely a discussion over abortion, yes or no, but a matter of civil liberty and the right to decide on your own. So are you two connecting the dots here, or are you seeing the overturn as focused on the issue of abortion?
I first want to respectfully disagree with my colleague here on the panel, the professor. Life clearly begins at conception. Once an egg is fertilized by the male sperm, it does create a unique being. That body grows and develops as it develops in the womb, just as it grows and develops outside of the womb. We see a baby, we see a toddler, we see a child, we see a preteen, we see a teen, and we continue to grow older. That progression continues. Same person, same body, not the mother's body, beginning at conception. And that being said, about liberty and freedom, let's look at that. The body within a woman's body, that child, that life deserves life. Now, when it comes to the ability to make decisions for our bodies, absolutely, I do agree with that. We have the decision to have sex or not in the vast majority of cases. Now, there is the rare 1%, which we still do not support rape, incest exceptions in those cases. The vast majority of cases, if you are mature enough to engage in the act of sex, you are mature enough to understand that life is conceived through that act, and we need adults who can take responsibility for their actions. So, yes, do you get to choose? Yes, choose before you have sex whether or not you're mature enough to raise a child. And if you're not, perhaps rethink that decision. Abortion is not health care. Abortion is not contraception. Abortion ends a life 100% of the time. And it seeks to end a life 100% of the time. I actually am friends with several abortion providers who sadly are marked by their mother's decisions, and thank God they made it. But the reality is abortion seeks to end a life 100% of the time.
Nicole, are abortion pills the next front of this culture war, so to speak?
Well, abortion pills have been something that's on the market and something that provider, because there isn't one, we will see an increase in that being the use that is made. It's the next political front, if that's what you mean, and that the anti-choice movement is certainly going to be exploring different ways to prohibit them to be sold in certain states. They're looking at how you can address women who decide to cross state lines to obtain an abortion, because the reality is being able to obtain an abortion now in the United States is very reliant on your financial status. There are going to be those who can afford the ability to, if they're not having an emergency, like an ectopic pregnancy that needs to be ended for their safety, and they don't have time to travel in order to do so. But if you are looking and seeking an abortion because you've made that decision and you have the financial means to travel, be able to take that time off work and go someplace where you can have a provider safely do that, you'll have that ability. But if you don't, then the pill is going to become the only option that you have. And now we're going to start seeing the problem of, are women ordering it from a place where they're getting the right medicine, and is it safely done? What if there's an issue that they need to see a doctor following that? So it'll be the next political front of what we're dealing with on this issue, yes.
And Professor Rimholt, as you've alluded to earlier, in the immediate aftermath of the overturn, some warned it's just the tip of the iceberg. Several months later, is that so? Are we seeing the court going after other rights?
So let me make some things clearer with regard to what I said earlier. A forced pregnancy, and when you impose a ban on abortion, you're basically forcing a woman to carry a pregnancy to term. So a forced pregnancy is the harshest form of imposing on a person to make bodily sacrifices for others. And what I meant to say earlier, that there is no comparison in other areas of law, that the law forces people to make such bodily comparisons. And if we're talking about this ultra-conservative court that came up with the Dobbs decision in June, so just several months before Dobbs was decided, the court made another decision with regard to OSHA, the agency, the federal agency that is responsible for the health and safety of all workers in the workplace.
Okay.
And the court said that when OSHA decided that every worker in the workplace, in big workplaces, would have either to get the vaccine or to be tested for COVID, the court said this cannot be. Because
Professor Rimholt, we have to put a stop right there because we need to take a break, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Professor Noya Rimholt, Amy O'Donnell, and Nicole Brenner-Schmitz. Thank you, ladies, so very much for staying with us. We're also, of course, staying on topic. But before we get back to our conversation, let's take a listen to Vice President Kamala Harris in one of those marches on the anniversary of Roe v. Wade.
Understand clearly, the majority of Americans oppose these attacks. Americans of every background, in every community, have voiced their perspective. From Kansas to California, Michigan, Montana, Kentucky, and Vermont. They spoke with their vote.
Okay, ladies, let's get to it. Where's the line between policy making and personal liberty? Once again, we begin with a quick fire round, 30 seconds each, and we pick it up from there. So, Professor Rimholt, please take the lead.
So, not personal liberty, but bodily autonomy. We're talking about bodily autonomy that derives from the constitutional right to liberty. And when it comes to bodily autonomy, every person should be given the utmost protection to their bodily autonomy, even when it conflicts with the rights of others, including the right to life.
Nicole Brenner-Schmitz?
Well, I think the professor said it well. Look, Roe was built upon a whole host of decisions from the Supreme Court that led to a conclusion in Roe. It was further elaborated upon in Casey. This is about people having the liberty to make their own decisions about their own health, about their children, about their own bodies. And this is what the United States is based on. We need to have the liberty to make these decisions about ourselves. We've seen our Supreme Court go forward and forward and forward, and this is the first time we've taken a massive step backwards.
Last but not least, Amy O'Donnell, your take?
Yes, so the Supreme Court looked at the constitutionality of states' abilities to ban abortion before viability and determined that there was no constitutional basis for Roe, and thus they overturned Roe and returned the ability to legislate abortion to the people and their elected representatives. So as Kamala Harris has said, people are voting, and what she missed is that people are voting life. And in many states across the United States, they're seeing life protected state by state by state because they elect pro-life legislators who support their values.
And speaking to that point exactly, let's open the discussion, and please feel free to interact. Maybe it's not such a bad idea to give every state the option of deciding this way or the other. Should each state hold a referenda on the matter? Nicole?
I mean, look, we're seeing states address what's happening. In this past election, Republicans really thought they were going to run the gamut and have a red wave. We didn't see that delivered. We saw Vice President Harris use Michigan as an example in her speech. In Michigan, people weren't even really targeting that state Senate and that state House. Both flipped to Democrats. We held the governor's mansion. One of the first acts Gretchen Whitmer was going to do is reverse an archaic 1931 law that's on Michigan books about abortion and it being a possible criminal act for women. We are going to see things happen across the states. That doesn't mean that it should have been sent to the states. We should, as a nation, protect women's rights to have the decisions about their own bodies, make their own economic choices, make a decision for their families and themselves. But yes, we're going to see this fight come to the states. We saw for the first time a party that had the House, the Senate, and the White House flip state Senate and House chambers and not lose a single one. Democrats and people across this country understood what was at stake in their states. We had a banner year winning Secretary of State, governors, and state legislative races, and they're going to take it to the next level in 2024. And these are going to be a real focus as we go forward in this fight for women's rights over their own bodies to win these state legislatures so that the 7 out of 10 people who support abortion in this country, the right to have one, are represented.
So, Professor Rimmelt, is there a middle ground here, or is it this or that type of debate?
I see no middle ground because I think that the Supreme Court was asking the wrong question when it decided to overturn Roe. The Supreme Court, the justices were asking whether the founding fathers of America were thinking of a woman's right to abortion when they enacted the constitutional right to liberty. But this was, of course, the wrong question to ask, because at the end of the 18th and 19th century, women were treated as objects. They were not considered as the proper subjects of right. So this was the wrong question to ask. The right question to ask was, what was the concept of liberty that the founding fathers had? And in what respect bodily integrity was an inseparable part of this right? And if they were asking this question, they would come up with the right answer. And the right answer is that every person's right over their body is such a fundamental right that you cannot undermine this right. You cannot take away this right. And what is going on right now in America is that every state has a full discretion to do what it wants with women's body. And that means imposing forced pregnancies on women. This has no comparison in law, in legal jurisprudence. And this is a horrible time for women's rights in America.
Amy.
I have to laugh a little about the concept of forced pregnancy. Again, in the vast majority of cases, nobody is forcing a woman to be pregnant. A woman chooses to engage in the act of sex and therefore chooses that a natural potential consequence of that is that she might conceive a child. And that is something that she needs to decide if before she engages in that act, if she's mature enough to walk out the responsibility of that or not. And if she is, there are options to keep the baby or place the baby in a loving home for adoption. But But in the vast majority of cases, nobody is forcing a woman to be pregnant. And the reality is, the lie has been long perpetuated in our society that women need abortion to advance in our country and in the world, and that is simply not the case. It's not either or, it's both and. We women have the capacity to both give birth to our children, planned or unplanned, regardless of the circumstances of their conception, and achieve great things. It is so insulting to our capacity as women that so many have perpetuated this lie that we have to choose. But the reality also is that the body within a woman's body is not that woman's body. It is a separate being from the very beginning. And we protect life, and we protect these areas of people taking life. And so it is something that should be legislated. And just a quick correction, it's not just at the state level, it's the people and their elected representatives, that state and federal. We know in the House and Senate there aren't votes to pass any federal laws protecting abortion, and there is not enough votes to pass the bill that we just saw pass the House, the Born Alive Infant Protection Act, should be a no-brainer, probably won't pass the Senate. This conversation is going on at a federal level and a state level and at the voter level, and that's where it will continue to unfold.
And on all levels, as we are nearing the end of our conversation here, ladies, should men be part of this conversation at all, or should they be excluded? Nicole?
Well, I think the reality is men are voters. They're part of this conversation. Both sides seem to have men that are allies. I have to chuckle at the idea that we have the choice every time we have sex. I guess each and every time a woman who's already a mother has sex is supposed to consider if she gets pregnant that time. I mean, it's just so ridiculous. I can't really even with it.
It's not ridiculous at all. It's just a fact. You know, you can choose to engage or not. And if it happens,
I think that a woman's economic situation does not affect whether she's able to have a child or not. 2/3 of women who obtain abortions in the country are already mothers. They know exactly what goes into having a child and how to raise them, and they're making that decision for the children that they already have and for their families. This is
killing an unborn child is not an economic decision. In Texas, we allot $100 million to help moms. Over half of the births in our state are paid for by the state's Medicaid program at a tune of $1.2 billion a year.
Well, ladies, some laws will never be broken. It is always getting heated when we need to end. But we sincerely do appreciate your time and insight this evening. Amy O'Donnell, Professor Noya Rimmold, and Nicole Brenner-Schmitz, thank you so very much for joining us.